Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee, reflecting on the biggest news stories of the past 7 days in depth, with context, clarity, with 4 distinguished world affairs journalists. In a week where President Trump has threatened to sue the BBC for $1 billion, an unprecedented lawsuit against a foreign media company after it emerged a Panorama programme misleadingly edited his speech. The Telegraph newspaper broke the story of the manipulated clip. There was also a damning internal dossier of alleged BBC bias on issues of trans identity and the Gaza war. The doctored speech dates back to 2021 when a violent mob stormed the US Congress on the day President Biden's election win was being certified. The documentary, broadcast just before last year's election, appeared to show Donald Trump explicitly calling on supporters to head straight to the Capitol building and fight. The BBC said it was an error of judgment. So too, perhaps, its decision to stay silent for days after the story emerged. 2 of the broadcaster's most senior staff resign, and with reports of an internal battle over media management and intense political pressure, we'll look at the implications for the BBC and on trust in journalism.
And I think that the president was deeply concerned by the editing, the purposeful and dishonest editing of his speech that was so clearly fake news.
Been a week that's seen President Trump send a formal letter to the Israeli President Isaac Herzog asking for a favour to grant a pardon to his ally, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's facing a long-running trial for alleged bribery and fraud. In a letter made public by Isaac Herzog's office, President Trump wrote that while he respects the independence of the Israeli system, quote, "The case against Bibi, who fought alongside me for a long time, including against Iran, is political, unjustified prosecution." It's a plea the president had already more than hinted at on a visit to Israel's parliament last month.
Mr. President, why don't you give him a pardon? Give him a pardon. Come on.
It's also been a week of a series of firsts for Syria. The first president to be welcomed to the White House, and a strange sight to see Ahmed al-Sharaa, the former al-Qaeda fighter who had a $10 million UN bounty on his head, shooting the breeze with President Trump. This was no normal leaders' meeting, though. No fireside chat, no press questions allowed. A cautious welcome in from the cold. Al-Sharaa wants Washington to lift sanctions placed on the regime that he toppled, and he got sanctions suspended in exchange for counter-terrorism cooperation. The strangest moment, though, the obligatory gift exchange.
It's the best fragrance. Come here, man.
I have more here, sir.
Okay? So what we'll do is just take that, Joe, put it in, and then the other one is for your wife. How many wives? Your wife.
This week also saw severe droughts in Iran. The release of the French Algerian writer Boualem Sansal, being detained for a year in Algeria, finding himself at the centre of a diplomatic crisis, and the government shutdown in the US coming to an end. Well, joining me on the panel this week in the studio, the journalist and the media consultant Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet. Good evening to you,
Good evening.
Philippe. Professor of Political Communication at Sciences Po University in Paris, co-author of The President, a Political Fable, a satirical tale imagining a populist TV host becoming president and looking at the blurring of lines between entertainment and politics. Quite prescient. Very good evening to you. Let's start with events. Here's your book, Across the Channel this week. What you've made of this apparent plot against the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, a plot concocted by party rivals that Keir Starmer's own spin doctors seem to be putting out and briefing first on.
You mean about the BBC?
No, have you heard about the plot against Keir Starmer?
No, I'm discovering with you. I don't know anything about it.
Well, this is a plot that's
I'm
also under the triage of information about the BBC this week. Possibly a good time to bury difficult news, and it's a nice time to bring in Henry Samuel as well, Paris correspondent for The Telegraph, who might explain to us as well. Great to have you with us tonight, Henry. I want to talk to you about a couple of things. On the issue we were talking with Philip about a second ago, what's your understanding of this, the whole Wes Streeting plot going on against the British Prime Minister?
I'm really sorry to have to tell you this. Well, I may be the Telegraph's Paris correspondent, but I've been so busy dealing with the Paris attacks anniversary that I haven't been following it closely. Obviously, I'm fully aware that Keir Starmer is under a hell of a lot of pressure, in the UK from within his own side, and many kind of talks of plots to oust him that I am aware of. But
there's a reason for your concentration this week, and that is you've been reflecting on the 10th anniversary of the Bataclan attacks, and you were there. I was there. You were that. Your offices were just outside from the Bataclan at the time. It's a week of vigils, ceremonies, silence for the victims. You've done an incredibly powerful interview this week. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was actually. So I was in Paris 10 years ago, and obviously covered it. My office was just 100 yards from the Bataclan, and by the way, 100 yards from Charlie Hebdo, which was attacked earlier that year. And obviously, you just get your head down and you cover the news at the time. So I never really revisited it myself until now, and I found this anniversary extremely powerful and actually quite moving myself, particularly when I met a bunch of people who survived the attack, and the person two of the people I met, in fact, were taken hostage, and miraculously survived that hostage drama. Obviously, 90 people were killed inside the Bataclan, most of them in the pit, when 3 terrorists opened fire. But a bunch, 12 of them were kept hostage for 2.5 hours, and told to keep a lookout. And the one that I particularly interviewed was Arnaud Simonin, who was the last hostage to be released. There was a final assault by the BRI, the elite police, when they realised there was no point trying to negotiate with these terrorists. And incredibly, they blew the door down, managed to get all of the other hostages out, but Arnaud was kept between the 2 remaining terrorists, and so he couldn't escape. And when the police moved in, he somehow managed to distance himself from the 2 terrorists. One of them blew himself up, the other one was shot, and then he also blew up. And Arnaud explained to me that for about 10 minutes he thought that he was either dead or about to die because he was covered in blood, until he worked out that it wasn't his blood, it was that of the terrorists, and he'd come out of it unscathed. So in a sense, and it sounds awful to say, but he was one of the lucky ones. I mean, he survived. Others were killed or maimed or had terrible, obviously post-traumatic stress. And I did speak to a bunch of others, and their reactions are very varied. And what's very uplifting about Arnaud, and I met another hostage called Stéphane, is that they have formed a very strong bond between each other. They're friends. They call themselves the potage, which is put means mate in English, and otage means hostage. So they were hostage mates, and they've really kept themselves. They've supported themselves over all this time through thick and thin, and you really sense that they are now turning a page. And just there was an acclaimed TV series about their friendship. It's called Des Vivants, the Living, and it's about how they overcame it, and it was based on these hostages, but part fictionalized. So it was a very moving experience to meet them. There were others who are finding it harder, actually. I met another woman who was injured. She was shot a couple of times, called Sophie Parra. She left Paris. She couldn't cope living there anymore. She got over the physical scars, but she's still suffering. Every time, I hear this quite a lot, every time something happens, there's a sudden surprise noise, she can be transported back to the room. And so it's very hard for her. And yet another person I met said that in a way her second life, her better life, started that night. She survived and just realized how lucky she was to be alive, carpe diem, etc., and is now enjoying herself. So there's been a very, very different reactions to it. But what I can say is that the whole of Paris was really scarred by this, not just those who were hurt. And that's I realised that myself, living in that area. But we've all come through. And
I think about the difficulty which we don't often think about too much, of a journalist covering something as viscerally emotive as that and coming back to a story. I remember exactly the week's events, the other news events going on, because there was a big summit, if I remember 10 years ago, in Malta at the time, an EU-Africa summit about another drowning at sea. I was at the BBC at the time. Well, the whole team had come off the plane, 10 o'clock at night, straight from Brussels, where the team were based. We all went straight to the Bataclan. And for you, having your offices so close, it's one of those commemorations, those events that you kind of dread coming up. But when they come, how was it for you covering it, as well as the interviews, just being there as part of the commemorations?
It's just, the sense that it could have happened to anyone. I was supposed to be going to one of those cafes that evening. I didn't go. That was chance. Everyone could have been there. Lots of people I know could have been or were there. I personally walked past the Bataclan 15 minutes before the attack and took myself a Vélib bike and went home. And then this happened, and I could have just been caught up in it. So there's that terrible sense of just the arbitrary nature of it. It's very difficult to kind of cope with. But what's, as I say, is encouraging is that the spirit in Paris and in France has remained strong. One of the people I interviewed was the head of La Belle Équipe, which was one of the worst hit, in fact, a cafe, 21 people died. It's a guy called Grégory, and he lost his wife in the attack, and he's got an 18-year-old daughter, but he refused to give up, and he has opened many other bars and restaurants in Paris, and he said that's his act of resistance. It's just to carry on the Parisian way of life, the cafe culture. And so that's all extremely heartening. But yes, I have to admit, it was far, far harder than I expected to go back to it, just because, the scars are still there for us all.
Really good to have you with us tonight. It is a great, very powerful read as well in The Telegraph. Henry Samuel, thank you. Let's move from the studio. Let's go to London. Let's bring in Tom Standage, Deputy Editor at The Economist, editor its Future Gazing annual feature, The World Ahead, which has been released this week. It is great to see you, Tom. Crystal ball time. Tell us about what we should be thinking about. Some of the predictions for 2026. And worth noting, your predictions for 2025 were particularly prescient as well, particularly on tariffs.
I think we all knew tariffs were going to come, but the thing that we got right was that we said that the initial impact of the tariffs was likely to be quite muted, and that has been the case. We're looking forward to 2026. I think the way to think about the coming year is that it's a sort of pivot between where the way things have been in the past few years and where things are going to go next. And there's an enormous amount of uncertainty in the world right now. We don't know really what's going on with geopolitics. We had a very clear paradigm from Joe Biden of autocracy versus democracy, and a sort of new Cold War between America and China. And it's really not clear what Donald Trump's sort of foreign policy is in many respects still. Then we've also got uncertainty around trade with the trade war. We don't know what's happening. The state of liberal democracy in Europe in particular is in peril, and we don't know what's going to happen there. Then we've got economic uncertainty. Will there be a bond market crisis? That's something else that's very close to what's going on in France right now. And then what's happening with technology, with AI? Is it going to take all of our jobs? Is it going to lead to a recession? We don't know. And so I think the thing about 2026 is that we are going to get answers to quite a lot of these questions. And the answers that we get are going to really shape the next few years. And so I think, what happens in the coming year in many ways will shape the coming decade. So that's the way I think about this new year as we get closer to it.
And your Economist prediction cover, you can lose yourself in that for hours working out all of the themes. One dominant theme I want to go back to, though, is tariffs. And why I say that, because a thread that you link to for 2026, what we may not think about offhand, is an interesting World Cup in the months ahead, isn't there?
There is. So the World Cup is being hosted by the US, Mexico and Canada. And let's just say they're not getting on particularly well at the moment. They're supposed to have this big free trade area, the USMCA, which was, the Donald Trump update of the NAFTA treaty. And he comes back into office and immediately tears it up. And so they are in the process of trying to negotiate a new trade deal. They're also hosting this this enormous football tournament at the same time. And Donald Trump is saying things like he wants to take some matches away from dangerous cities, in other words, democratic cities. And then the whole idea of the World Cup is that you welcome people to your country and they come and watch the football, and it's a sort of, an advert for your country. And welcoming lots of foreigners to America is not really on brand for Donald Trump right now. And we have this very strange message from the administration, which is basically everyone is welcome to come and watch the football, but then get out. And so it's going to be very, very interesting, this whole thing on the pitch and off it.
Tom, great to see you tonight, and these are very interesting predictions that I would recommend a read. OK, let's move from Tom. Let's go to Italy. Welcome our next guest as well. Joining us from Rome, Chiara Pietro, the host of the podcast The Essential, a daily review of the news in Italy and worldwide. Chiara is former Paris correspondent and anchor at Sky Italia's TG24. Pleasure to have you with us too tonight, Chiara. How are you? Tell us about The Essential and what you've been looking at this week.
Well, it's been a very intense week already. Buonasera, everybody. It's nice to be with you tonight.
And you.
It's been a very intense week. We've been dealing a lot with the Bataclan attacks as well, because as you might remember, there was also an Italian victim in those attacks. So every year it has been important for Italy to take care of. I'm going to put earplugs. You might hear me not very well, maybe.
No, we can hear you perfectly. Carry on. We're listening. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So we've been covering what happened in Paris very well this week, and I've noticed, having lived in Paris for many years, that this year the way we commemorated those attacks was very different from the past. So we spent a lot of time in The Essential as well, analyzing the situation in France. We see an evident political struggle currently, thinking about the pension reform and how it was frozen, surprisingly, from an external Italian point of view. The way those commemorations were almost clivant, almost dividing in the public opinion, thinking about Salah Abdeslam, the quest for restorative justice, and how the debate was implemented by that in France. We've been debating a lot about Sarkozy, the fact that he was liberated from jail, and the case was, put in comparison a little bit with the Berlusconi's judiciary situation that was for sure very different from the one of Sarkozy, but still brought us back to the time where we had to confront with judiciary unpleasant situations being too close to politicians in their first row of importance. At the same time, Sarkozy's case being treated by the political opinion in France as a very divisive case. So we've been talking a lot about France, for sure, and also about the BBC, because we have the impression from Italy as well, from the right perspective, of the public TV system, that there is maybe the deepest crisis we've ever seen in the mainstream medias. And the BBC case really highlighted how important it is now more than ever for those public systems to find again a trust and a point of listening to
a first issue, because let's start, as Chiara was saying, it is great to have you here with us tonight on the BBC. We'll get straight into it, as set up perfectly by Chiara. Sunday evening, 7:05 here in Paris, 6:05 in London. The press team for the BBC releasing a statement, two of its most senior bosses resigning in the wake of a backlash over a misleading edit in a documentary about President Trump, one of the most trusted news organisations in the world, engulfed in a credibility crisis. 6 days after a scoop by The Telegraph revealing a leaked internal memo by former BBC advisor Michael Prescott alleging systemic bias, institutional groupthink in coverage of Trump, the Israel-Hamas war, particularly with BBC Arabic, and disproportionately favourable towards trans activism, suppressing gender-critical voices. Critics claim the BBC is, quote, being captured by left-wing woke politics with an ideological bias, fiercely contested by BBC journalists, including some who've put forward that this is a coup, a hostile takeover from conservative forces aiming to destroy the organisation. This was Deborah Turnus, the outgoing BBC News CEO, as she was doorstepped by reporters.
I stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with me. But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased. That's why it's the world's most trusted news provider.
Well, two of the most powerful jobs in global news up for grabs, but whoever takes it on now will have to deal with the spectre of President Trump and a $1 billion lawsuit threat. President Trump gave the BBC a deadline Friday, this evening, to issue a full apology over the mistake. By Thursday night came in the response, a sorry, though it rejected demands for compensation. Philip, let's start with you. One of the most consequential scoops of the year, I think, for Henry's organisation, the Telegraph. The mistake itself, how do you see it? And what do you think is at the heart of this story?
I think it's a mistake. It shouldn't have been done. We all agree on that. But I think it was indeed a concerted effort on the part of the conservative forces. And calling them conservative is a bit, it's a way of understating it. And I think that Donald Trump, it's a typical case of a double standard. The populist media on the side of Trump, they never apologize for being, biased, lying, trying to sell anything to anyone. And they never apologize. But they do want us, the Democratic side, the Democratic media, to absolutely apologize for even the most minor mistake. Why? Because they really want to destroy these medias. They don't care about the truth anyway, and we all know that by now, especially with the Epstein files problem that Trump has actually. So it's a real democratic fight. I think they shouldn't have resigned. They should have maybe apologized sooner. The BBC should have. They should have said earlier, very early on, that there was a mistake. Maybe, fire someone, because obviously someone was in charge of that, but not the top of the BBC. It's sad. It's unprecedented, and it worries me a lot because Farage is not far from grabbing the prime minister seat, and all of that is like Musk and Trump are really grabbing on the British political system in the most worrying way, really.
It's interesting listening to Philip, Tom. I note one thing, a particular headline in The Economist this week, saying this: how the exasperating, indispensable BBC must change. Why does this story matter, Tom? And what do you see happening next?
Well, I don't think the lawsuit's going to go anywhere because this was something that was shown on iPlayer in the UK, and if as people outside the UK know, you basically can't get to the BBC stuff outside the UK. Just legally, this is very flimsy. The other thing is that, obviously what the BBC did was wrong, but when Trump has shaken down American news organizations, he's had a lot more leverage over them. They've wanted to, he's threatened to take away their licenses, or he's threatened to block mergers that they were trying to do with other companies. And so, basically they've given him money to make him go away. That's not going to happen with the BBC because he hasn't got that kind of leverage over them. And they have apologized. And I think just under British law, I don't think he has a very good case here. So I don't think that's going anywhere. But he just likes throwing big numbers around, and this is theatre. As for the BBC itself, I think the really striking thing is that the job of being Director General of the BBC essentially seems to consist of your job is to resign when the next scandal comes along, and it will come along. It doesn't seem to me to actually run the BBC. What happened in this case is that the memo that figured that all about all of these various mistakes has been sitting around since January. No one has done anything with it. It's a completely sclerotic organisation. So our prescription for it is, we do think it's indispensable, particularly on the news side. This is a time in history when having accurate, reasonably unbiased news sources is more important than ever. And the BBC does great work, not just in Britain, but it also does reporting around the world. And this is not a good time for that to go away. If you look on Facebook, at the most followed news pages in English, the top 5 are all Chinese sources that are reporting their version of the news in English. And the BBC is number 6. So we really do need the BBC to be doing what it does. And we think the thing to do is to split off the entertainment arm, because there's lots of entertainment you can get from Netflix and YouTube and Disney Plus and whoever else you want to get it from, and actually have ring-fenced funding for the news organisation, which really needs to be protected. And if the BBC was less sprawling, it would be much easier to manage. So I think that would help with a lot of these problems.
So bad news for the BBC, a question of trust of public broadcasting. Notably interesting listening to Joe Rogan, the most listened to podcast in the world, talking about, he saw it, in his opinion, there was some lying going on, but he said this is supposed to be the arbiter of news, essentially. So even the podcasters who talk about mainstream media acknowledging public broadcasting, this is where people go to in times of need. So there is a ripple effect to worry about. Henry, bad news for the BBC, very good news for the Telegraph.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I appreciate what you're saying, Philippe, but it's a rock solid scoop, and I don't think there was it had to be called out. I mean, it was pretty crude. And when you look at the edit and as you said, it's been sitting around all the time, and it was somebody who was auditing the BBC, an external auditor who came up with this, and he brought it up many times. He kept saying, look, this isn't good enough. We shouldn't be doing this, and no one listened to him. So I think the Telegraph did the BBC a service, quite frankly, of bringing this out. I'm the last person to say that the BBC shouldn't exist. Of course, it's an incredibly important voice in the world, but this kind of sloppy behaviour shouldn't go on, and somebody needs to be accountable, and they have fallen on their sword.
Because it wasn't just the error it pointed out; it was about alleged systemic bias when it comes to Gaza, to the trans movement, to not giving voice to gender critical voices.
Yes, there were other strands to it, of course, but the main one was the Trump speech, and the latest reports from the Telegraph, it wasn't just on Panorama. It was then done again later into 2022. So the same report spliced was used twice. So you could once was perhaps a mistake, twice not so.
Chiara, listening to Henry, there seems to be three distinct parts to this. There's the accusations of BBC bias, there's the doctored edit itself, and then there's the opportunism politically, the pressures, the opportunism from the White House, talking about actually go to a Trump-friendly media outlet, as some see it, GB News instead. What are you making of that?
It's for sure Donald Trump is campaigning against mainstream media, and this has started already with his first mandate, so no one is surprised about that. And of course, what happened with the BBC is a win for the United States president in this moment. At the same time, I believe this is the reason why the two main figures of the BBC did well to step down, because in moments like this that are crucial for the credibility of mainstream media, it is important that someone can be held accountable for mistakes. And it was indeed a mistake. We can debate over the importance of the mistake itself, but it's the principle that is extremely worrying. I mean, we have given for granted the credibility of mainstream medias for a long time now. And with the new medias, podcasts, and other medias appearing, it is clear now, especially through social media, that people are not ready to trust the system so easily anymore. So any big mistake or small mistake made by a mainstream media like the BBC has to be paid, pass me the term. I'm thinking also about the Louvre Museum, the fact that in that case, the director of the Louvre didn't step down after the mistake linked to what happened with jewels of France. That was also a very bad sign, because it means that the politics is not ready to consider itself accountable for the mistakes that are done, and somehow anything can happen and they will still remain in place. And I link all this to a more broader lack of credibility of the system versus the anti-system that is going online mainly, that's voting more for external new parties, and that is there, even if sometimes legacy medias and legacy politicians wouldn't like that part of the public opinion to exist, or tries to ignore it or to censor it. So more than ever, I believe the BBC scandal is serving us all, and not just Donald Trump, or whatever happens to this lawsuit. I don't think it's going to lead anywhere. But the fact is that we all need to hear about the importance of the mainstream and mediatic media's system, and the importance of rebuilding it with the best intentions and values.
Very interesting. But on the issue of the error, we're now waiting, the BBC are waiting for a response to the response from President Trump. The BBC saying it apologises, but there isn't an issue of defamation. Tom just pointed out this wasn't shown in the US. The argument might be from prosecutors suggesting that they could have a VPN and therefore watch it. But let's see this play out. The other issue, it didn't affect him. He still won the election. On the issue of trans rights, the BBC board says this. On the review of sex and gender identity, the BBC says its editorial guidelines and standards committee noted much of the coverage met the standards of impartiality and accuracy. And Tom, this takes us, I think, to a wider debate about the service of public service journalism, public broadcast. And Chiara talking about the alternatives, chipping it in the wings. When it comes to crisis, people look for a bastion, somebody to trust. And often, time and time again, polls show that is the BBC, that is public broadcasters. We've seen Trump effectively shutter. Meanwhile, American news broadcasting companies, not quite closure, but diminishing them. The Voice of America, Free Radio Europe, described as a cost-saving measure to curb left-wing bias. There is a bigger politics playing out here, Tom, isn't there?
There is, and the BBC has a global brand. And if you look at surveys of American consumers, the BBC ranks very highly as a trusted news organisation. And so I think part of what's going on here is that, if Donald Trump intervenes in the midterm elections next year, which is entirely possible, or, does anything else where he doesn't like it when people report what's actually going on, this is a way to undermine trust of the BBC among American consumers. He can say it's all fake news, they made that thing up. So this is why it's such a terrible own goal for the BBC to undermine its own credibility in this way, because as you say, in the event of national disasters, things like the pandemic, we were all reminded of the importance of national broadcasters to sort of bind the country together. And in fact, you can argue that in the 19th century, it was the invention of newspapers and then later on radio that sort of bound countries together and give us the modern conception of what a country is, which is where kind of everyone speaks exactly, you get all the regional dialects disappearing in Italy and things like this. So yeah, there is a sort of really important role that public service and national broadcasters play here, and it's not just in their own countries. It can, in fact, be wider than that as well. And I think that's why Trump is quite keen to undermine the credibility of the BBC, because if he does bad things, they are going to be calling him out on it.
Well, we can hear you. Apparently we have some sound issues, but we will proceed until we hear otherwise, because here in Paris this week, around 5:30 Wednesday evening, apparently we're having technical problems. Let's just double check with the gallery that we can be heard. Can we be heard in the gallery or not? We will be back in a couple of minutes. We have sound issues. We'll be back in 2.
They observe. They contact us. They report, film, photograph. They are the voice of the voiceless. Your eyes in the far-flung reaches of the world. The Observers, a network of 5,000 committed citizens working with France 24.
One of our observers in Côte d'Ivoire.
Amateur footage and testimonials checked by our journalists and broadcast weekly on The Observers, on France 24 and observers.france24.com.
This week on Paris Dessert, the many delights of Athens. Explore the capital's cuisine with Dina Nicolaou, the ambassador of Hellenic gastronomy.
On a des oursins grecs et des huîtres sauvages grecques. C'est la mérésée, tu vois?
La mer est dans l'assiette.
Then, embark on a true culinary journey with Michelin-starred chef Arnaud Bignon.
On va préparer ce très beau canard. On va le cuire et ensuite on va le fumer dans une boîte avec des aiguilles de pin.
Pastry chef Stelios Paliaros tells us about his revolutionary approach to Greek desserts. Valérie Fayol takes you to Greece in Paris Dessert on France 24.
Wow! Ella, bravo! C'est délicieux.
The water tastes bad. This farmer in southern Vietnam has seen his rice yields drop steadily over the past 5 years. He lost 40% of his harvest last year alone.
Saltwater from the sea has now reached our fields, damaging the rice plants and their grains. It destroys the whole crop. The rice here is ruined. Look at this. It looks so weak.
Rice paddies contaminated by salt become infertile, and in this part of Vietnam, climate change is to blame. Sea levels are rising between 3 and 5 millimetres a year. As a result, salt water is seeping further inland and across the flat plains of the Mekong Delta. The 18 to 20 million Vietnamese who live on or around the Mekong Delta rely on it for their livelihoods. Seawater isn't just threatening rice, fish are at risk too. A university in southern Vietnam is studying these changes in partnership with a French agricultural research institute.
We will capture the fish with different types of salinities, and after that, the fish can show the adaptations, the changes in refinement with the different types of salinities.
They combine laboratory research and fieldwork. These scientists make regular boat trips to a small island where they've uncovered another problem: rising water temperatures, again driven by the climate crisis. And they're worried, as warmer water is leading to the extinction of certain species of fish.
It's the experiment for the striped catfish.
Here, they're focusing on catfish, the Delta's most recognisable fish. In 2024, Vietnam produced around 1.6 million tonnes of catfish. That's 42% of the global catch.
For pangasius, the highest acceptable range of temperature is 35 degrees centigrade. Last 2 years, we have been monitoring pangasius pond water temperature in Vietnam and Cambodia, and what we have noticed that during the summer, it goes up to 37 degrees, so 2 degrees higher than the maximum tolerance level.
In response to rising sea temperatures, many Delta residents are turning to a new form of aquaculture. It's a sustainable alternative for farmers who can no longer grow rice. In Cà Mau province, vast aquaculture farms cover more than 300,000 hectares of land that was once used to grow rice. In these ponds, algae help cool the water, while fish and shrimp are raised together. It's a self-sustaining ecosystem in which each species supports the other.
When shrimp produce waste, we recover it along with the water from their ponds, which contains nutrients. We then pump that water into the fish tank. The algae continue to purify it, and soon it becomes clear again.
This former rice farmer is in no doubt that aquaculture is the key to survival in the Mekong Delta.
Welcome back to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee. We had some technical gremlins for the first time in the studio, complete blackout in the gallery as well. But we're back, we're here, and we march on, because it was here in Paris this week around 5:30 on Wednesday evening at the lower house of the French Parliament of the National Assembly. The result came through on the vote to suspend the country's deeply controversial pension reform, a reform law aimed to reduce the country's debt by raising retirement age from 62 to 64 was once viewed as a cornerstone of President Macron's agenda. The bold economic reformer who defied months of protests in 2023, forcing the law through Parliament by invoking Article 49.3, a last resort rule in the French constitution, essentially allowing the bill to bypass the lower parliament. And that was then. This is now. 5 prime ministers have come and gone since. Elizabeth Borne triggered Article 49.3. Would have been 6, but the current prime minister, Sébastien Lecornu, has got a second chance after resigning the first time. That makes him count twice, and that was out of a lack of other choices for President Macron. It would enable his centrists to stay in power, while no political bloc has an overall majority. Well, the vote on the pension reform isn't a change of heart by the president. It is a strategic concession to secure the support support of the Socialist Party to avoid the Macron government being toppled in a no-confidence motion. 201 was the magic figure needed. The result, 255 in favour of dropping the reforms, 146 against. Good news for pensioners in France, bad news for the French debt, leading a budget still that hasn't been passed. Philippe, we'll start with you. Has this shored up the government for now?
I'd say it's a historical moment when the parliament has defeated the president. It doesn't happen very often, but this time it happened. So this measure was really pushed, forcefully pushed on the French public, on the French electorate, including the president's own electorate. Nobody wanted this measure to pass. Nobody wanted this pension reform. It was unpopular to at least 80% of the population rejected it. So in the end, the parliament took over because the parliament was against the president. And then, in a way, a normal democratic process was reestablished, meaning that the collective decision not to do it won against the will of one person to maintain it. It's unprecedented, and frankly, this is both a good and a bad thing. It's a good thing because, well, the parliament has reached kind of agreement, and we are in a coalition, kind of a system that could work. We could avoid the parliament to be dissolved and everything. And the other thing, the negative thing is that, well, the president has still 2 years to go, and we wonder how we will be able to achieve this mandate. And it's, well, we're entering troubled waters because, as you know, we are like the British. We have a monarch, except that ours has got a lot of power. So we're not used to be defeating him this way. Usually we cut their heads. Defeating them in parliament is kind of a new thing under the recent years.
There's a bit of similarity as well, listening to you, Philip, Henry, in the speed of prime ministers that France is getting through, not too dissimilar to the speed of prime ministers Britain has been getting through. But with this decision, has it prevented another exit, at least for Sébastien Lecornu, before Christmas?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of quietly admirative of Sébastien Lecornu. He was kind of written off as this, you know, sort of lackey who had no charisma, and he's turned out to be probably the man for the job. I mean, it's a terrible job to have to do. Obviously, and no one's got any kind of majority, and so they hobble on. So yeah, but I mean, the situations. I mean, Parliament now has the power. Philippe says that it's a monarchy. I mean, the Fifth Republic is a parliament. You know, it's a semi-presidential system, but actually, it's supposed to, you know, repose on the Parliament. And it, particularly when the president doesn't have a majority in Parliament, and that's what's happened now. So the power is in the Parliament. The problem is the Parliament is completely and utterly divided, and they're finding it very difficult to make any headway. And they're just not used to it. They're not used to having that power. They don't know how to make coalitions and stuff. And what we're seeing, I mean, it is. Still, there is no budget. The debt, as you said, is appalling. The worst budget deficit in Europe last year, and currently heading towards a pretty big one this year. So they're not out of the woods yet. But it's still the bottom line is: can they afford to do this? What they're doing now? Can they really afford not to have to raise the retirement age? It obviously seemed from abroad, it does seem incredible. But Macron's played a terrible hand. You know, he forced through a reform that wasn't actually a presidential pledge in 2022. And he did so, you know, by avoiding any kind of parliamentary debate. So it was very... Interestingly, today, there's been a poll out by ELAB suggesting that 68% of the French think that they should be, you know, that they're going to have to go back and reform, you know, the pension system. They know it can't go on like this. This issue. They know something has to be done, but no one wants to really take the bull by the horns and do some of the painful stuff that's going to have to be done. You know, the system cannot pay for itself, and by freezing the pension system here, it's going to cost. I think it's something like 400 billion next year, and 400 million, and 1.8 billion the following year. I mean, France can't afford that. No,
I've seen quotes 300 to 400 million already. Chiara, listening to Henry talking about President Macron as well, to think about in this. This was kind of legacy legislation, wasn't it? And at least no more for now. And in the autumn, we are in the autumn of his presidency too, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, I consider that what's happening in France with the pension reform being suspended is the worst news for all French people, because, I mean, it's clearly not a measure that France can afford. Let's continue what we were saying. It's clearly something that is not going to be supported in the future. I mean, it's an increasingly aging population, what we have to deal with all over Europe. So clearly going à la retraite, retiring so early will not be so sustainable anymore in the future. But being France through an unprecedented political crisis, somehow changing governments every 6 months, no one will be really held accountable for this mistake, apart from Macron, that is already at the lowest point of his presidency. And it's clear by the mere fact that this pension that represented his second mandate has been suspended. And it was possible because no one has the power, I believe, in this moment. I mean, neither the parliament, neither the president. The real problem is that no one is in charge for real. So the revision and the modification of the Fifth Republic of France is probably necessary, and we know it today more than ever. When will it be 2027? I don't think so. I believe that the elements are there for something to change before then, even if Macron really doesn't allow that.
To your point, it's worth saying this. Look at the polls right now. They are not flattering. This is rare. I mean, they rarely are for leaders in power particularly, but Le Figaro's latest poll, late October for President Macron, gives him an 11% approval, Philippe. This is the lowest approval rating for President Macron in 70 years of polling French presidents.
Yeah, I know it's low. It's always like that in the end of a mandate. This president is at the end of 2 mandates, actually 10 years. We are at 8 years out of 10. So it's normal that it would be low in the polls anyway. Even if he had done popular things in the past, he would be unpopular. And he has been through so many crises. This president will be remembered as the president of crisis. We had every kind of a crisis. We had the COVID, we had the war in Ukraine, and he was very bad at some. The COVID was not really well handled, but he is very good at Ukraine, in handling the Ukraine crisis in the end. So we need to, let it rest. And anyway, we'll be gone soon. So what worries me is the next president, and I hope he will be, a moderate democratic guy wearing tweed jackets. I would rather have that than a orange painted faced guy with ludicrous ideas, and by the way, a huge deficit.
Be careful what you wish for. We are what comes next, mind you. Tom, across the channel where you are, Keir Starmer facing strikingly similar figures to Macron's. 16 months after his landslide victory, the pollster Opinium shows him with a 17% approval rating, 62% disapproval, 56% of Brits calling for his resignation. This is a new low in modern polling history. Jinx with the French here, the neck and neck again, only for the prize that no one wants, Tom.
Yeah, this is true. We have got through a lot of prime ministers lately, and we have a very unpopular, national leader right now, just as you do in France. The other thing we have in common is these enormous deficits, and I just can't believe what I'm seeing. France has an incredibly low retirement age, and it tried to raise it by a little bit, and it does this every few years, and it always gets undone. And France has a deficit of 5.5% of GDP. This is a country that is walking towards a bond market crisis, and Bardella would be even worse. His plan to close the deficit is basically to ask the ECB to print money. Of course, this is unpopular. Everybody votes for free money for themselves. Nobody wants to have to work for longer. Honestly, but just look at what the retirement age is 66 in Britain. It goes up to 67 next year, and then it goes up to 68 a few years later. There are several countries in Europe, Denmark, the Netherlands, Greece, where they did the sensible thing, and they linked the pension age to life expectancy, because it's even more unacceptable to retire at 62 if you're going to live to be 100, which an awful lot of people are. So I just don't know what you're all smoking. You're all talking about how, what the political implications are and who has sovereignty, and this is an economic disaster that is about to happen, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, it's particularly bad in Britain and France. The other country that's got a massive deficit that's also at risk of a bond market crisis, but is a bit different, is the US. And that would be because of the politicization of the Fed potentially next year. So we'll see. But yeah, one of our predictions for 2026 is the risk of a bond market crisis is growing, and America, France, and Britain are the places to watch where this might go wrong. And it would not be pretty, because it would mean the bond markets would impose austerity on the governments of Britain and France. That is where this is
Tom,
going.
these conversations, your discourse is reminiscent of what we're hearing in the National Assembly, and yet it doesn't break the mould. And to which, Philippe, you were champing at the bit to come in there. What did you want to say?
Yeah, I think we are still in the EU. That's the difference between us. Maybe we are a lot more, relaxed because we are in a collective, way of handling the deficits. That's one point. The top executives in the French government, they plan on a 4.6 deficit next year, and they hope to be staying in that neighborhood. I don't know how to translate that properly. And they think that if it lasts for 2 or 3 years, that's okay. And if it lasts for more, and if it goes wide, if the deficit is larger, then the European Central Bank will have to intervene and will be into trouble, but that's not the most likely scenario. They are quite relaxed, actually, nowadays, even with this pension reform debate. They are not really stressed because they think they are too big to fail, and there are guidelines under the EU that protect us, and also we have a deficit for sure, but we had deficits in the past, and we will survive.
Too big to fail, so said Ozymandias as well. Philip,
I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying it's being said.
Well, time, perhaps. This is something that Chiara mentioned a short while ago. Perhaps allows for a cosier, rosier perspective. Doing time, albeit briefly, has been former President Nicolas Sarkozy. 13 years since his presidency. His approval rating peaked at 65% and fell to around 20 when he was in office. Despite that, and since then, despite proclaiming his innocence, he's been convicted in 2 major criminal cases for illegal election campaign financing and for conspiring to fund his 2007 campaign, and then later on a campaign using the money from the late Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi. After 3 weeks in prison, a first for a former French president, he's been released ahead of an appeal trial to be held next year. He was allowed to take 3 books to prison with him, thematically appropriate perhaps. The 2 volumes of The Count of Monte Cristo, the Alexandre Dumas tale of a man falsely accused of treason who escapes to exact revenge on his betrayers, and a biography of Jesus Christ, selected according to his team for reflection. And he was reportedly using the time to write his own book on faith and justice. The response for Parisians who spotted him in a restaurant shortly after his release. Let's take a look. Henri, I'm going to ask which page the bookmarks were found in of those 3 novels, but I will ask you what you made of the time served by President Sarkozy and how he played the prison PR around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm still kind of confused about the fact that he went to prison, and because it is a strange system. Obviously, he was going to appeal. He's not a threat to public security, but the judge ruled that the seriousness of the crime was sufficient, that they were just applying the law, which is that you go to prison while waiting for the appeal. But what's happened is it went to another judge, and the judge ruled that actually no, he could come out. So that does make you question, should he have been in there in the first place? But it is an incredible sight. It's an incredible. I mean, not since Marshal Pétain has a French leader been put to jail, so it is. But when you look, obviously he's been convicted not once, not twice, but 3 times. So it's difficult to start saying that all the judges are against him, and the whole thing's. And that's another thing. I mean, there is this. It is a worrying turn, I feel, in France. Increasingly, politicians are accusing the magistrate of being politically motivated.
Yeah, it's a populist phase, obviously. And the former President Sarkozy tried to exploit that in a way in order to, build kind of a defense for the sake of the public opinion, mainly because the fight was lost in the court anyway. And I don't know, it's a good thing that we were able to put a president in jail, like Brazil did with Bolsonaro, for instance. Bolsonaro did something way worse than Sarkozy, but still it's a good thing democratically. But for 3 weeks, it raises questions. Obviously, it helps his defense, but also it could give to the people a feeling that, you know, it's a little bit, that we can convict a president, but still is a bit above the law, and that's not a good thing. So I've got mixed feelings about all that.
Chiara, Philippe talked about the image of him, and this is post-prison release polling from Alab, the pollster. 25% of the French have a good image of him, so that is better than Macron, even with the prison sentence, and it is on the rise, up from 2 points from October. Polling of right-leaning conservative circles has it at 43% favourable. Can we read anything into that? A return to politics, perhaps? Chiara?
I don't think we can go to that extent of the return to politics. I think the fact that he was sent to jail is actually the mark of an end, the end of a certain right, traditional right in France, the old right that has come to an end. They wanted to make a symbol of him, symbol of, for sure, the fact that anyone, any politician is the same in front of the law and has to go in jail if he's condemned. They marked his time spent in jail as a symbol of functioning system. I'm also puzzled by what happened, because on the contrary, I think this case became a boomerang for the magistrates and for the justice system in France, ending again in a very confusing debate. Of course, Sarkozy portrays himself as a victim of a bad justice and a biased justice system, and it's easy for him to say that, because of course being condemned, he deserves to pay for that. But at the same time, how many people that are not politicians would have been sent to jail for the same condemnation? Probably no one, because he was a symbol. Someone else wouldn't have been a symbol like him. So I don't think he's gonna be willing to go back into presidential race or a primary political role. But at the same time, I think he will manage in the end to use it on his own behalf, against the will of the magistrates.
Well, Tom, Nicolas Sarkozy so far described it as grueling. I just wonder, given that the information we're getting from his press team about this writing inside prison, are we looking at a top Christmas bestsellers list? Is that the aim right now? Jordan Bardella, having released his second book, Tom, he sits below Asterix in the bestsellers list. I just wonder whether we are going to be hearing of Sarkozy's 21 days inside.
That's a writing retreat, and I think he wouldn't be the first person who would have done that. And you know, there's a history of political memoirs where people kind of make them up in retrospect. So who knows what he might claim to have written in prison? I think the main thing is that, you know, the law should apply to everybody. There was a period in French history where politicians did seem to be above the law, and the, you know, cases would be dropped or never come to trial, or they'd get very, very lenient sentences. So you can argue about whether or not this rule that, you know, people still have to go to jail while they're appealing is a fair one or not, and that's fair enough. But I think, you know, essentially applying the same laws to everyone is a good principle, and politicians should not be seen to be above the law.
Politicians should not be seen to be above the law. It takes us perfectly to our final subject, which is Tel Aviv, a month on from President Trump's so-called victory lap after getting Hamas and Israel to agree to a ceasefire. In an aside towards the end of that Knesset speech last month, he spoke of the Israeli Prime Minister being one of the greatest wartime leaders, pointing out to the country's President Isaac Herzog. I have an idea, he said to Herzog. Why don't you give Benjamin Netanyahu a pardon? I like him, he said. Cigar, champagne, who the hell cares about it, he said with a smile, and was met with a standing ovation by Netanyahu supporters. Well, the cigars and champagne refer to the luxury gift allegedly accepted by Mr. Netanyahu and his wife Sarah, worth between $195,000 and $330,000. Bribes for political favours, say the prosecution, denied by the Prime Minister, who says they were from close friends and states he hates champagne and rarely finishes cigars due to interruptions. Well, the trial, ongoing since 2020, has featured over 140 witnesses, expected to continue until 2027. And this week, the Israeli president confirmed he has in writing a request from President Trump calling the corruption case against his ally a politically unjustified prosecution. Mr. Herzog has declined to say how he responded in the request for a pardon, but said anyone seeking it must seek a formal in-person request. Philippe, Is this a fait accompli? How do you see this going?
I think we are very, very far from the original, isolationist Woodrow Wilsonian positions that Trump supposedly was willing to have. So we are not at all like that. He's different. He's intervening a lot in other countries. We saw that in England. We see that in Israel, obviously, and he does that without any, really frankly and really heavily, loudly, like you were really an Israeli in the Israeli debate, which is kind of strange in a way. And of course, for him, taking bribes is not something very big, and obviously champagne and, it's far away from his own, he's being accused, Trump, of, collecting money from unknown donors through cryptos. So for him, I guess, getting some free champagne is like, a walk in the park. So, but obviously it diminishes the legitimacy of the legal system in Israel at a time where it needs direly to be, getting back to a normal kind of a system that could enable to get out of the crisis and maybe to have real peace agreements and not this kind of ceasefire that allows Hamas to be, reestablished as the main force. I mean, it doesn't do any long-term politics or long-term planning. Trump does give the feeling that what he wants is his allies, friends, and so forth to be protected from everything, shielded from the law, shielded from every consequences that the political could have, and that's obviously a ludicrous thing to do. But that's how multilateralism goes these days.
Multilateralism goes that way these days. Chiara, the point raised by the opposition leader Yair Lapid is it's raised obvious questions about American influence, about Israeli policies and Americans' influence of it, as Philippe talked about. But in the midst of a series right now of visits by US officials to Israel since the truce, the Israeli media calling these visits Bibi-sitting or Bibi-sitters, keeping up this intense diplomacy. There is another aspect to this, Chiara, which is I've heard from another of US official sources saying that by dropping this case, any expectation that Netanyahu, from critics, might want to extend the war so he doesn't have to face them, well, that disappears. What do you make of that?
I believe that Netanyahu is obviously babysitted by Donald Trump in this moment. So the fact that he might be helped in his judiciary process by the US president is only a collateral consequence of the fact that the states are imposing their geostrategical vision over Middle East on Israel as well, whether Israel and Netanyahu agree with it or not. In this moment, it's not so important to Trump whether Netanyahu is strong in his political government, if his allies are supporting him and supporting the US role or not. What's important to Donald Trump is that he can impose his vision and the American vision as a consequence over the Middle East. We saw that with the Al-Shara visit to the White House. It is a cynical, maybe the most cynical act of this presidency. At the same time, showing once again how Donald Trump can, if he wants, do basically anything in the Middle East, because he managed to somehow sign this truce that is, in a way or in another, at least on the surface, resistant.
Both, just listening to Cara's points, just a final thought from both you, Henry, and Tom as well. Closing thoughts on this. I just wonder if it's a clever move, Henry, from President Herzog. He's asked for a formal request, come from either Netanyahu or his lawyers or his family. And I'm minded to think about comparisons to Nicolas Sarkozy, who we spoke about when on trial in France. There was some on the right saying that he should ask for a pardon. And he said, quote, "I won't seek it. I'm determined," quote, "to prove my innocence."
Yes. Well, I think he's right. I mean, I've got to hand it to him. I mean, it's far better to prove your innocence in a court. He's allowed to appeal. He's appealing, and he believes that he's going to be found innocent. So all I can say is all credit to him. The other thing is, I highly doubt that Macron would give him a pardon, because he would probably just throw the ball back in his court and say, well, I think you should appeal. We're talking about Herzog and Netanyahu. I mean, you do wonder if what Trump has done has actually been counterproductive for Netanyahu, because clearly the justice system will now want to prove that it is completely and utterly impartial. So it may not be helping Netanyahu's cause.
Tom?
Trump helping himself. It's a very, very common pattern for Donald Trump to say that the judiciary is corrupt and it goes after people like Bolsonaro or like Netanyahu. They'll say this is all a witch hunt because that means that when he says that attacks on him are a witch hunt, he's saying it's part of a wider pattern. He also likes to pardon people who have done things that he is accused of, and he also likes to say that things he is accused of don't really matter, like receiving gifts. And he's been given all sorts of things, lots of them made of gold, over the years. So this is very, very much Donald Trump sort of saying things that help him in the future and reinforce his narratives. And I would see it through that lens.
Really good, all of you tonight. Tom, thank you. Thank you to all the panellists. Insight and clarity. Thank you to Philip Moreau-Chevrolet, journalist professor, political communication expert, MCBGC consultancy. Henry Samuel, Paris correspondent at The Telegraph. Thank you to you as well in a big scoop week for The Telegraph. Thank you. London, Tom Standage, deputy editor at The Economist, editor of the annual World Ahead feature, just out and well worth a read. Thank you, Tom. And Chiara Piotto in Rome, the host of The Essentials podcast by Will Media. Thank you to Chiara. And thank you for watching. We will leave you with one of the week's viral moments, capturing the much anticipated and rapturously received return of Tom Felton as Draco Malfoy in his Broadway debut in Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, reprising the role, the only original cast member to do so. He first played a quarter of a century ago. This was the reaction and an admirably stoic response. Mischief managed. We'll see you in 7 days for The World next week.